She arrived at his door before dawn, while the stars were still burning holes in the Montana sky, and the first thing she did was tell him he was a fool. Not in a cruel way. Not in the way Colt Mercer had heard it said 100 times before, by foremen who thought he was too stubborn, by neighbors who thought he was too proud, by the woman who had ridden 2,000 miles on a promise she didn't fully believe in. No, this was different. Maeve Rowan stood in the doorway of the most pitiful excuse for a cabin she had ever seen in her 28 years of life, looked him dead in the eye, and said, "You expect a woman to walk into this and call it home?" He had no answer, because she was right. And somewhere in the silence that followed, the wind cutting through the cracked door, the smell of burned coffee still hanging in the cold air, the sound of his own embarrassment, Colt Mercer felt something shift inside his chest that he would spend the next 6 months trying to understand. Before we go any further into this story, if you've ever been judged the moment you walked into a room, if you've ever been told without a single word spoken that you didn't belong, then this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button and stay with me until the very end, because what happens between these three people in the Montana Territory of 1876 is the kind of story that changes how you see strength, love, and what it really means to belong somewhere. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it really started. 3 days. That was all Colt Mercer had before Vivian Hale stepped off the stagecoach and became, at least on paper, his intended wife. He'd written her 7 months ago. A short, functional letter. Not romantic, not poetic, just honest in the way men who've spent too long alone tend to be honest. I have land, I have cattle, I am not a drunk, and I do not raise my hand to women. I am looking for a partner, not a servant. If that interests you, write back. He hadn't expected her to. Most women didn't write back to men like Colt, men with dirt under their nails and no soft words to offer. But Vivian Hale had written back, and 4 exchanges later, she'd agreed to come west. He'd felt relieved when he sealed that last letter. He'd felt something close to hope. What he felt now, standing in the middle of his cabin at 6 in the morning, was something far less dignified. Panic. The cabin was, he had to be honest with himself even if it hurt, a disaster. Not a romantic, rugged disaster, a genuine, embarrassing one. The kind that would send a woman straight back to the stagecoach without a second glance. The table he ate at had a crack down the middle that he'd been meaning to fix since April. The curtains that had come with the property, left behind by the previous owner, were brown with age and something he didn't want to identify. The floor had been swept maybe 3 weeks ago. The rope on the bed frame had stretched and sagged until the mattress lay almost completely flat on the floor planks. The hearth was caked with old ash. There was a mouse living in the wall near the window. He knew this because he could hear it most nights, and he had been putting off doing anything about it because it seemed pointless to evict one mouse when the whole structure needed work. He stood there with a cup of terrible coffee and looked at all of it. And then he walked outside, sat down on the porch step, and tried to think. The trouble with Colt Mercer was that he was better at working than thinking. He could fix a fence post in 20 minutes, ride 20 miles in bad weather without complaint, talk down a frightened horse. But arranging a home, creating the kind of warmth that made a person want to stay, that was a language he had never learned. His mother had died when he was 11. He'd grown up among men who swept floors with their boots and cooked beans directly from the can. The war had finished whatever soft edges he might have developed. He was 34 years old, and he had spent the better part of his adult life becoming extremely competent at surviving and almost completely useless at anything else. The morning stage had already rolled through Silver Creek the day before, which meant Vivian was somewhere between here and the next waypoint, probably spending one final night in relative comfort before her life changed permanently. She'd be here in 3 days. And he had 3 days to turn this, he looked back at the cabin, into something a woman could stand to live in. He didn't know where to start. It was while he sat there trying to convince himself that the curtains could be washed and maybe wouldn't look so bad once they dried, that he heard the sound of wheels and hooves coming up the main road from town. He squinted at the horizon. A freight wagon, old but solid, moving too slowly for anyone in a hurry. He watched it slow near his gate, which was also something he'd been meaning to fix. And a figure climbed down from the bench without waiting for anyone to help her. She was a large woman. Even from a distance, he could see that clearly. Broad-shouldered, round-faced, wearing a travel dress that had seen better days. She had a canvas bag slung over one arm and the kind of posture that said she was tired but had no intention of letting that stop her. The wagon driver waited a moment, exchanged a few words with her that Colt couldn't hear, and then pulled away without looking back. She stood at his gate. "Is this the Mercer property?" she called. He stood. "That's right." "I'm not here to cause trouble." She said it matter-of-factly, like she'd had to say it before and found it sensible to get it out of the way. "My name is Maeve Rowan. I've been traveling since Bismarck, and my arrangement to join the next party heading west fell through by about 4 hours. The man at the general store in town said you might have work for a short time. Cleaning, cooking, whatever needs doing. I'm not particular." Colt looked at her for a moment. He looked back at the cabin. He looked at her again. "How short is a short time?" he said. 3 days?" she said. "I leave on Thursday." He almost laughed. He did not know, standing there in that moment, that the universe had a very specific sense of timing. "Come in," he said. He had expected Ma, and this was his failure, not hers. Someone who would need showing around, who would ask where things were kept and require some getting used to the space. He had expected, if he was being further honest, someone less capable. It was wrong of him. He knew it was wrong even as he thought it. But he'd formed a picture in his head, and Maeve Rowan walked through his door and immediately began dismantling it. She set down her bag, walked to the center of the room, and turned in a slow circle. Not speaking, just looking. He stood near the door and watched her take inventory the way a general takes inventory of a battlefield, calm, precise, already calculating. "You've got 3 days, and one of them is almost gone," she said. "What is she like?" What?" "The woman who's coming. What does she like?" She moved to the window and pinched the curtain between 2 fingers the way a person holds a dead mouse by the tail. "This needs to go. Do you have anything else?" "There's flour sacking in the barn." "That'll work." She dropped the curtain. "What is she like, Mr. Mercer?" He thought about Vivian's letters. She'd mentioned books. She'd mentioned that she hoped the country would be different from what she imagined. She'd mentioned, once, almost in passing, that she'd grown up in a house with a real kitchen and missed the smell of bread baking. He told Maeve this. She nodded like she'd expected exactly this information. "All right," she said. "I'll need the flour, whatever salt and fat you have, and something to scrub that hearth with. Do you have a broom?" "In the barn." "Of course it is." She said it without judgment, like it made perfect sense that a man would keep his broom in the barn. "I'll start with the floors. You start with the walls." He opened his mouth to say something about how he had cattle to check on, and then he looked at her face, and then he went and got the broom. So, by noon the cabin had changed. Not dramatically, not like something out of a picture book. But the floors were clean, the ash was cleared from the hearth, and the broken table leg that had been propped up with a piece of firewood for 6 months had been properly repaired using the same tools she'd found hanging untouched on a nail by the door. The flour sacking, washed with water she'd hauled herself and hung over the fence to dry in the October wind, was now cut and pinned over the windows, and it let in the light in a way the old brown curtains never had. He was on the roof replacing 3 split shingles when she called up to him. "You have any dried herbs?" He considered this. "I've got some wild sage in a bundle somewhere from last summer." "That'll do something, better than what I've got." A pause. "What happened to your stove?" "What about it?" "The left side fire pot is cracked. You're losing heat." He hadn't noticed. He'd been losing heat all winter and hadn't noticed. "Can it be fixed?" "With the right clay it can." "Is there any riverbed clay near here?" "Down the eastern slope, maybe a quarter mile." "After the roof," she said, like they were partners who'd been doing this for years. "You can show me." He went back to the shingles. He found himself working faster. She didn't talk much while she worked, and neither did he, and they found without either of them planning it that they had a comfortable way of being in the same space without filling it with noise. He was used to silence, but a different kind. The silence of loneliness, of a man rattling around inside a too quiet house. This silence felt occupied, present, like the air itself was doing something useful. Around 2 in the afternoon she made coffee, better coffee than he'd had in months, using the same coffee he'd been burning every morning, which suggested the problem had never been the coffee, and set 2 cups on the repaired table without asking if he wanted any. He sat. She sat across from him. "How long have you been out here?" she said. 6 years? Alone? Most of it. She wrapped both hands around the cup. Her hands were not delicate. He noticed this without meaning to. They were working hands, wide-palmed, with short nails and a small scar on the back of the right one from something she hadn't explained. "And you sent for a wife," she said. "I did." "Why now?" He looked at the window. The flower-sacking curtain moved slightly in a draft he hadn't been able to find and fix yet. "I built something," he said, "and I started wondering what the point was if there was nobody to build it with." Maeve was quiet for a moment. She didn't say anything sympathetic or decorative. She just said, "That's an honest reason." "You heading to California to join your brother?" he said. "I am." "He sent for you?" "He didn't have to." She looked at her cup. "There was nothing left for me in Ohio after my mother passed. Caleb's doing well out there, he says. Has a house with a real foundation." A faint smile. "I've never lived anywhere with a real foundation." Colt thought about that. He thought about what it meant to carry yourself the way Maeve Rowan carried herself. Straight-backed and deliberate. When the world had apparently given her very little soft ground to stand on. He thought about how most people who showed up at his gate looked around at the isolation and the dust and the distance from anything resembling civilization and found some reason to leave quickly. She had shown up, asked what needed doing, and started doing it. He did not say any of this out loud. He finished his coffee and went back to the eastern slope to dig clay. The stove repair was her idea and her execution. She mixed the clay herself, packed it into the crack with a patience he watched from across the room without interfering, smoothed it level with a flat piece of wood, and then set a slow fire to cure it while she turned to the problem of supper. What she produced from his barely stocked larder, dried beans, a length of cured pork, 2 onions that had seen better days, and a handful of that sage, should not have been as good as it was. He'd eaten beans and pork 100 times on this ranch, and they had always tasted exactly like what they were, something to keep a man from dying. What she put in front of him that evening tasted like a meal someone had thought about, like each ingredient had been given a purpose. He ate too fast. He was aware of eating too fast but couldn't seem to help it. "Good?" she said. She wasn't asking for compliments. She was asking the way a craftsman asks, clinically, wanting information. "Very," he said. She nodded, made a note of something, apparently, in whatever internal ledger she kept. "I'll do the bread tomorrow, if the flour's good." "The flour's fine." Then she'll walk in on Thursday to the smell of bread. That's the first thing she'll notice. She was already clearing plates, moving with that economy of motion he'd noticed all day. Never a wasted step, never an action that didn't serve something. First impression is smell. Sight is second. If the bread is right, the sight of the curtains won't matter. He watched her at the wash basin. "You know a lot about making a place feel like home." She didn't answer right away. She washed a tin plate and set it to dry. "I know what it feels like to walk into a place where you're not expected and feel it anyway," she said. "Not welcome, just expected, like the room was built knowing you'd come." She set a second plate to dry. "That's what I'm trying to do for her." Colt thought of Vivian. He thought of the 7 months of letters, the careful, measured way they'd moved toward this arrangement, like 2 people crossing a frozen river, testing each step. He thought of how he'd never been able to write anything in those letters that was actually true. Not because he'd lied, but because truth required a kind of knowing he didn't have about her or about himself. He thought about how he'd spent one afternoon with Maeve Rowan and already felt he understood something about her that 7 months of writing hadn't given him about the woman he was engaged to marry. He didn't let himself think too long about what that meant. The second day was harder work and better company. He'd woken up expecting her to be slow to start. She'd worked hard the day before, and the room she was sleeping in was cold. But she was already at the stove when he came in from the morning check, and the smell that hit him when he opened the door was the smell of bread dough rising in the warmth. She'd found the breadboard he hadn't known he had, tucked behind a crate of old newspapers. "You kept papers," she said without looking up. "From Sacramento. Traveler left them. Might be useful in the cracks under the door. You're losing heat at the floor level, too." She shaped the dough with firm, practiced turns. unless they mean something to you. Use them. She used them. While the bread rose, she did the cracks. He came in for water around mid-morning and found her on her knees at the base of the door, pressing folded newspaper into the gap with the flat of her hand. He nearly said something. He didn't know what he would have said. Something about how she didn't need to do that, maybe. How that was more than she'd agreed to. But he said nothing, because the truth was, she had taken ownership of this small project in a way he found unexpectedly moving, and he didn't want to interrupt it. He brought in firewood instead, more than she needed. The bread came out that afternoon. It came out the way bread almost never comes out when you're making it under frontier conditions with uncertain flour and a stove that had been cracked for who knew how long, brown and even, with a crust that gave under pressure and a smell that did exactly what she'd said it would do. It filled the cabin. It went into the walls and the curtains and the floor and stayed there, patient and warm. He cut a piece without waiting for it to cool all the way and burned his fingers slightly and didn't care. "Good?" she said. "Better than good," he said. She allowed herself a small private smile. Not for him, for the bread. That evening, they sat longer at the table after supper than they had the night before. Not because there was more to say, but because neither of them seemed to be in a hurry to end it. She told him about Ohio, about growing up the oldest of 4 children in a house where money was always close enough to touch, but never quite in hand. Her father had been a skilled man, a carpenter, but a difficult one. Not cruel, just absent in the way some men are present in a room and absent in every way that counts. Her mother had been the one who made the house feel like something. When she passed, 18 months ago, the thing that had kept them all in the same orbit went with her. "I'm not sad about going west," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not running from anything." She pressed a thumbnail against a seam in the table he'd repaired. "I'm just going to what's next." "You're not afraid?" She considered this with the same seriousness she gave everything. "I'm afraid of being somewhere that doesn't need what I can do," she said. "That's the only thing I'm actually afraid of." It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in years. He recognized it because he'd never been able to put words to something he felt himself. The quiet terror of being capable and unnecessary, of having something to offer and no place to put it. He recognized it, and he said nothing, and the fire burned down between them, and the bread smell stayed in the room. The third day. He woke up on the third day knowing she was leaving tomorrow, and found that this knowledge sat in his chest differently than it should have, than it had any right to. She was a woman who had worked for him for 3 days. She was on her way to California. These were the facts. He couldn't quite make them feel like the only facts. She had changed things. Not dramatically, she hadn't rebuilt the cabin, she hadn't transformed it into something it wasn't, but she had looked at what it actually was. Neglected, underestimated, capable of more than it showed, and had treated it with the patience it deserved. And something in the way she'd done that made him feel like she'd been looking at him the same way. He didn't say this. It was not the kind of thing he knew how to say. He was in the barn when Vivian Hale's letter, the last one, sent from a waypoint 2 days back, found him via the boy who rode out from the general store. He already knew what it said. She'd been delayed one day. She'd arrived Thursday evening instead of Thursday morning. One more day. He walked back into the cabin holding the letter and told Maeve what it said. She looked up from the sewing she'd taken on without anyone asking her to. She was repairing the tear in his second blanket, the one he'd been putting off because he couldn't sew and was faintly embarrassed about it. "Good," she said. "Gives the curtains one more day to settle." "You could stay," he said. "One more day." She held his gaze for a moment. "I could," she said, "if there's still work to do." He looked around the cabin. The floors were clean, the stove was cured and drawing heat properly. The walls were scrubbed, the mattress re-roped so it sat at a real height, the windows clear and curtained with something that let in light. The smell of bread was still there, quieter now, woven into the place. "The fence along the north pasture needs a post," he said. It was true. It had needed a post for 2 months. She was already folding the blanket. "Show me where the digger is." They worked that 4th day, the same way they'd worked all the others, side by side, not talking more than the work required, finding again that comfortable rhythm that neither of them had planned for, and neither of them seemed willing to name. At one point, driving the fence post while he held it steady, She slipped in the loose soil and lurched sideways, and he caught her arm without thinking, and she caught herself, and neither of them made a thing of it. But his hand stayed for a moment longer than catching required, and she let it, and then the moment passed and they went back to the fence. He did not understand what he was feeling. He was engaged to be married. He was a man who took his words seriously. Too seriously, some people said, as though there were a right amount of seriousness for a promise. He had given Vivian Hale his word, and she had given him hers, and she was coming tomorrow, and this was the life he had chosen. He also knew, with a certainty that sat in his gut like a stone, that the woman standing next to him in the cold October wind, with dirt on her hands and her hair coming undone from its pins, was the most fully herself human being he had met in a very long time. He didn't know what to do with that, so he drove the fence post. That evening, her last evening, she made something with the pheasant he'd shot that morning and the last of the onions and a handful of dried pepper he'd forgotten he had, and it was a meal that didn't announce itself. It just quietly happened to be the best thing he'd eaten at that table. He told her so. "I won't remember the recipe," she said. "I didn't ask for the recipe." "No," she agreed. "You didn't." The fire, the quiet, the smell of the meal fading into the room. "You'll write?" he said. He heard himself say it and didn't know exactly what he meant by it. She looked at the fire. "If you give me an address, I might." He wrote his on a scrap of paper. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket. She didn't offer hers and he didn't ask, because California was a long way from Montana and some distances are honest. "She's going to be all right," Maeve said. Not quite to him, like she was saying it to the room. "Vivian, she's going to walk in here and she's going to see a real home and she's going to try." "Yes," he said. "That's something." She stood and began clearing the plates. "That's more than most people get." He nodded. He watched her hands. He thought about the fence post and the fire and the smell of bread on the second morning, how it had gone into the walls and stayed. He thought about a lot of things that night, and he did not sleep much, and when morning came she was already packed. They said goodbye at the gate. She shook his hand. Her grip was firm, and her eyes were direct, and she didn't make it into anything more than it was, which was the last kindness she did him. He watched the freight wagon take her back toward town until it disappeared into the flat gray distance. He stood there a minute longer than was necessary. Then he went back inside to wait for Vivian Hale. The cabin was warm. The curtains moved in the draft. The bread smell, faint now, was still there, worked into the wood, into the clay of the stove she'd repaired, into the air itself. He stood in the middle of his clean floor and understood, with the particular clarity that comes too late and too completely, that something had already changed in this room, in him, that no amount of waiting for the right woman would fix. He just didn't know yet what he was going to do about it. The stagecoach was 40 minutes late. Colt knew this because he'd been standing at the edge of the Silver Creek Post Road since 2 in the afternoon, and the sun had moved a full hand's width across the sky by the time he heard the sound of wheels and the driver's call cutting through the autumn cold. He'd changed his shirt twice that morning. He was not going to admit that to anyone, but it was true. Once, because the first one had a grease stain near the collar, he hadn't noticed until he was already dressed, and the second time because he'd gone out to check the water trough and caught himself on a nail. He'd stood over the wash basin in the repaired, clean, bread-smelling cabin and thought, this is what a man does when he is prepared. He prepares. He was not prepared. The stagecoach came around the bend with its usual noise and drama. The team blowing hard, the wheels throwing dust, the driver sawing on the reins. And it stopped, and the door opened, and Vivian Hale stepped out of it and into his life. She was smaller than he'd imagined. That was the first thing. Not a judgment, just a fact that the letters had somehow failed to convey. Slight framed with dark hair pinned under a traveling hat that had survived the journey better than most things would have. Her coat was a deep green, practical wool, slightly dusty from the road. She had a way of stepping down from the coach that was deliberate. She tested the ground before she committed her full weight to it, which was sensible for a woman who'd been bounced over 600 miles of varying terrain. She looked around the post road, taking it in, and her eyes found him. "Mr. Mercer," she said. It wasn't a question. "Miss Hale." He took off his hat, held it, put it back on. "Welcome to Montana." She looked at the dust settling around the stagecoach. She looked at the distant line of the mountains to the west, purple and vast in the late afternoon light. She looked back at him. "It's larger than I expected," she said. "Most people say that." "I mean the sky." She was still looking at him, but there was something in her expression, not quite nervousness, not quite relief, that told him she was working through her own version of the same adjustment he'd been making all morning. "I mean, the amount of it. There's so much sky." "Yes," he said, "there is." He took her bag. She carried the smaller one herself, which he noticed but didn't argue with. They walked to where he'd hitched the wagon, and he helped her up, and she settled without complaint, and they started the ride back toward the ranch in the particular quiet of two people who have run out of the things their letters covered and haven't yet found what comes next. She broke it first. "The road is better than I expected. Worse in spring, mud to the axle sometimes. I'll remember that." She had her hands folded in her lap and she was watching the land roll past. "How far is the ranch?" 4 miles. Just under." She nodded. She asked him about the cattle, how many head, what breed, how he managed the winter grazing set. And he answered, and she listened with what seemed like genuine attention rather than polite endurance. And he found himself talking more than he'd planned to. About the way the north pasture drained badly in early spring. About the bull he'd lost to a broken leg the previous winter, and what that had cost him. About the neighbor 3 miles south, a man named Duffy, who had offered to buy him out twice and twice been refused. "Why did you refuse?" she said. "Because I built it," he said, simply, like that was the whole answer. She looked at him sidelong. "That's either very principled or very stubborn." "Probably both," he said, something almost like a smile. She looked back at the road. They came around the last bend before the ranch as the light was going amber, and the cabin came into view, and Vivian Hale went quiet in a way he noticed. She sat forward slightly on the bench, her head tilted. "You said in your letters that the cabin was modest," she said. "It is," he said. You've done work to it recently." She was looking at the windows, the flower-sacking curtains, pale in the fading light, the repaired gate, which he'd fixed that morning and had been meaning to fix for 2 years, the woodpile newly stacked and squared. "There's something different about it, from what I imagined." He said nothing. She stepped down from the wagon before he could come around to help, which he was beginning to understand was simply how she was. She walked to the door. She pushed it open and stepped inside. He stood at the threshold and watched her. She stood in the center of the room the way Maeve had stood in it 4 days ago, turning in a slow circle. But the inventory was different. She wasn't calculating what needed doing. She was experiencing something. He could see it in the way her shoulders dropped, slightly, like she'd been carrying something on them since Bismarck, and had just now been told she could set it down. "It's warm," she said. "Stove draws well." He said it before he'd thought about it. Then he thought about who had fixed the stove. He closed his mouth. "And it smells like—" She put a hand on the edge of the repaired table, steadying herself or grounding herself. He couldn't tell which. "Like bread. Like someone baked bread here." "Yes," he said. She turned and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, he thought, but with something else underneath it, something more complicated. "You did all this?" she said. It was not quite a question. It was the statement of a woman who was deciding whether to believe something that pleased her. He opened his mouth. The truth was right there, sitting at the back of his teeth. He had not done all this. He had done some of it, the roof, the fence post, the firewood. He had provided the flour and the sage and the cured pork. But the bread smell was Maeve's, the stove was Maeve's, the curtains were Maeve's hands cutting and pinning, the warmth that came from this room and went into a person's chest when they walked through the door. That was Maeve. "I had help," he said. "For a few days. Someone traveling through." Vivian nodded slowly. "A neighbor?" "Passing through," he said again. She was heading west. She needed work for a short time. He watched Vivian absorb this. She didn't press. She moved to the window and touched the curtain lightly with 2 fingers, the same gesture, nearly, that Maeve had used when she'd first assessed them. Different meaning, same motion. "She had good taste," Vivian said. "She did," he said. He set her bag down near the bedroom door. He told her supper would be simple. He'd cooked it himself, a fact that would quickly become obvious. And she said that was fine, and they sat at the table together for the first time, and he served beans and cornbread that were competent but nothing more, and neither of them said anything about the comparison. The first week was an exercise in politeness. Not false politeness, not the performance kind, the kind people put on when they're trying to deceive. It was the real kind, the kind that grows between people who genuinely wish each other well and are working very hard to make something function. They were both trying. He could see it in Vivian every morning when she came to the table with her hair already done and her questions about the day's work already formed, the same way he could feel it in himself every evening when he made an effort to actually sit at the table after supper instead of retreating to the barn on the excuse of something that needed checking. They worked alongside each other. She was not helpless. That surprised him, though he felt it shouldn't have. She'd grown up in a household that kept a kitchen garden, and she took over the remaining garden plot with the kind of methodical attention she brought to everything. She mended. She organized his papers, which had been in a crate since approximately 1872, into something that could actually be found. She had a natural aptitude for accounting. She'd mentioned it in one of her letters, that she'd kept books for her father's business in Cincinnati. And when he showed her the ranch ledger, she spent 2 hours with it and then showed him 3 places where he'd been overcharged by the grain merchant in town and 2 where his own calculations were off. "How much does that total?" he said. "Over 2 seasons? About $14. "That's not nothing." "No," she said, "it isn't." He looked at her across the table with the ledger between them and thought, "I am lucky." He knew this. She was intelligent and careful, and she was here, which was not nothing, especially out here, where here meant something. What he couldn't seem to produce was the feeling that he'd imagined would come with it. The feeling of rightness, of completion, of a door finally swinging into the position it was built to occupy. He'd thought it would arrive naturally, the way warmth arrives when you've been cold, gradually, undeniably, filling you up. But he and Vivian talked and worked and ate together and went carefully about the business of building acquaintance, and the feeling didn't come. He told himself it was too soon. He told himself he'd been alone so long that he'd forgotten how to be with anyone. He told himself a great many things in the barn at night while checking on horses that didn't need checking on. None of it was quite convincing. The thing that finally broke the surface came on a Tuesday in the second week. Vivian had been attempting biscuits. This was not a criticism. She had said herself that she was not an experienced cook, that her family had a woman who came in for that, and that she was willing to learn but would need to learn badly before she learned well. He had said that was fine. He had meant it. The biscuits were genuinely not edible. They had a texture that he could not name, something between chalk and damp leather. He ate one the whole way through because she was watching and he felt it was the honest thing to do, and then he set the second one down. "They're not right," she said. She already knew. She wasn't asking. "They'll improve," he said. "They're terrible," she said. Not with distress, just matter of fact, which he had come to recognize as her mode when she was being most herself. "What did the woman use? The one who made the bread?" He looked at his plate. "She never told me," he said, which was true. She hadn't. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She picked up the biscuit he hadn't finished and turned it over in her hand, not unkindly, like she was trying to understand what had gone wrong. "What was she like?" she said. "The woman who helped." He kept his eyes on the table. "She was competent," he said. "You said that like it was the smallest true thing you could say." He looked up. Vivian was watching him with the calm, steady focus she brought to the ledger, to the garden rows, to everything she examined seriously. He understood suddenly that she was a woman who noticed things and filed them away and did not announce them prematurely. He wondered how long she'd been filing this one. She was capable, he said. She knew how to look at something that needed fixing and fix it without making it into a bigger thing than it was. Like the stove. Like the stove. Vivian set the biscuit down. And was she pretty? The question was so direct that he felt it land in his chest. He considered lying. He considered saying something vague and sidestepping. He looked at Vivian's face and thought, she doesn't deserve vague. She came 2,000 miles on a promise. She deserves the truth. I don't think that's what I noticed about her, he said. First, I mean. But eventually. He was quiet. You don't have to tell me, Vivian said. She said it without injury, without performance. I'm not asking to start a fight. I'm asking because I think if I understand what happened in this cabin before I arrived, I'll understand what I'm actually walking into. She folded her hands on the table. I'm practical, Mr. Mercer. It's the main thing I am. And it seems to me that this marriage is going to require at least two practical people. He looked at her for a long moment. The fire, the failed biscuits, the curtains letting in the last gray light of the afternoon. She was traveling through, he said. She needed 3 days of work and I needed 3 days of help. It was a coincidence. And then she left. And then she left. And you've been thinking about her since. He didn't answer. His not answering was the answer. Vivian breathed in slowly through her nose and let it out. She didn't look angry. She looked like a person confronting a problem that is real and unwanted, but not yet fatal. Well, she said, I suppose that's honest. I'm sorry, he said. Don't be sorry yet. She stood and began clearing the biscuits. We're still at the beginning. I won't quit on something that hasn't been tried. She took the plates to the wash basin. But I need you to be straight with me, Colt. If you find you can't do that, if this is something that can't be gotten past, then I'd rather know it now than know it in 5 years. He absorbed the use of his first name, which she hadn't used before. That's fair, he said. It's not fair, she said. It's just sensible. She set a plate down with a sound that was more decisive than a plate needed to be. I'll ask Mrs. Duffy about the biscuits. He sat at the table for a while after that, and the silence was a different kind now. Not the comfortable kind, not the lonely kind, but the kind that has something alive in it, the kind that has been named. The weeks built on themselves. He found things about Vivian that were genuinely worth finding. She read in the evenings. She'd brought 3 books and worked through them slowly, with the attention they deserved, and sometimes she'd read something aloud if she thought he'd find it worth hearing, not to improve him, just because she'd enjoyed it and thought he might. That was her particular way of being generous, quiet and unceremonious, offered without pressure to receive it. She was also funnier than he'd expected. Not often, and not loudly, but she had a dry, sidelong wit that appeared without announcement and was sometimes gone before he'd processed it. Once, when he came in from the barn covered in mud from a drainage ditch that had collapsed on him, she looked at him and said, "Well, you've found a new approach to bathing," and went back to her book, and he stood there for a moment before he laughed, and it was the first real laugh he'd had inside these walls in longer than he could remember. They were building something. He could feel it, but he could also feel, with the same honesty that Vivian had asked him to maintain, that what they were building was a structure, not a home. And the difference between those things was precisely the thing he couldn't put words to, precisely the thing he'd understood better in 4 days with Maeve Rowan than in 2 weeks with the woman he was engaged to. He thought about Maeve less than he had in the first week. He thought about her differently, too, not with the sharp, inconvenient immediacy of those first days, but with something quieter and more persistent. The way you think about something that has already changed you after the changing is done. He thought about her hands and how she'd mixed the clay without ceremony. He thought about what she'd said about fear, being afraid of being somewhere that doesn't need what you can do. He thought about how she'd shaken his hand at the gate and not made it into anything more than it was. He thought about what that restraint had cost her, whether it had cost her anything, whether she'd ridden away on that freight wagon and not thought about him again. He told himself he would stop thinking about this. He continued to think about it. Well, the fracture, when it came, was not dramatic. That was perhaps the most telling thing about it. It did not announce itself with raised voices or a slammed door. It came on a quiet evening when the wind had been up all day, and they were both tired from it, the kind of tired that erodes patience without replacing it with anything useful. They'd eaten supper, and Vivian had been reading, and he'd been doing nothing in particular, which was itself the problem, or at least the symptom. He'd been sitting at the table with a cup of cooling coffee and his own thoughts, and he'd realized sometime in the last half hour that he couldn't have said what those thoughts were about. They weren't about the ranch, they weren't about the cattle or the winter supplies or the north pasture. They were somewhere else. "You're not here," Vivian said. She said it quietly, from her chair by the fire. He looked up. She had her book open in her lap, but she wasn't looking at it. "I'm right here," he said. "No." She turned a page she hadn't read. "You've been sitting at that table for an hour, and you haven't said a word, and you've looked at that coffee without drinking it. You're somewhere else." A pause. You've been somewhere else for most of 3 weeks. He set the cup down. I'm sorry. You keep saying that. Because I keep meaning it. She closed the book. She held it against her chest with both arms, a gesture that was less comfortable than it looked, more like she needed to hold on to something. I don't think you're a bad man, she said. I want to be clear about that. I think you're trying. I am. But trying isn't the same as succeeding, Colt, and She stopped. She pressed her lips together and looked at the fire, and he watched her assemble her thoughts with the careful precision she brought to the ledger, to the garden, to everything. I came out here prepared for hardship, she said. I came out here prepared for cold winters and hard work, and the kind of loneliness that frontier life puts on people, and I thought I could manage it because I'd manage it with someone, even if we started as strangers. She looked at him. I didn't come out here prepared to feel like the stranger was in my own house. The word landed quietly. The fire popped. I don't think of you as a stranger, he said. I know you don't mean to. She set the book on the chair arm. But every time I walk into a room and see you thinking, I know it's not me you're thinking about. And every time you say something about the cabin, about how good the coffee is or how the curtains block the draft, you go somewhere else for just a second, like you're remembering how it was before. She paused. Who she is, Colt? He looked at his hands on the table. Her name is Maeve Rowan, he said. She's on her way to California. I haven't heard from her. I don't expect to. Vivian received this information. She sat with it. Did you tell her? She said. Tell her what? That you felt whatever it is you feel. He shook his head. I didn't know what I felt. I still don't exactly. But you knew it was something. He could not honestly say no to that. He said nothing. Vivian sat for a moment longer, and then she stood. She was small, but she stood very straight, and in the firelight she looked like a person who had made a decision that hadn't been easy, but was not going to be reversed. I think, she said, that we need to be honest with each other about what this is. What do you think it is? I think we made an agreement that seemed like enough when we made it, she said. And I think it might have been enough if you hadn't met someone first, before me, in a way you didn't expect. She walked to the basin and hung her dish towel on its hook with the same care she gave everything. I don't blame you for it. I don't blame her either, I suspect, for being the kind of person people remember. She turned to face him. But I do need to know. Are you going to be able to put her down? The question hung in the room. He could hear the wind under the door. He thought about putting Maeve down the way you think about putting down something that has changed the shape of your hands. You can put it down. Your hands still know what they held. I don't know, he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said in 3 weeks. He could tell by the way Vivian's expression shifted, not with relief exactly, but with something like recognition, that it was also the answer she'd been waiting for. Thank you, she said. For not knowing? For saying so. She moved toward the bedroom door. We should sleep. There's no resolution tonight, but I'd rather know the real shape of a thing than keep trying to fit it into a shape it isn't. She went to bed. He sat at the table for a long time after, with the cold coffee and the fire going low. The curtains were still there. The stove drew well. The floor was clean. He thought about Vivian's hands on the ledger, her voice reading aloud in the evenings, the dry wit that appeared and disappeared before you'd fully caught it. He thought about what kind of woman tells a man the real shape of a thing rather than letting it stay comfortable and false. He thought she deserved a great deal better than what she was getting from him. He thought about Maeve folding the paper with his address into her coat pocket and whether she'd ever pulled it out. He thought about Silver Creek and the fact that the community gathering was next week and the freight routes that passed through it from the west. And then he stopped himself from thinking about that because thinking it out was one thing. Following it was another. He banked the fire. He stood in the middle of the clean floor. The bread smell was gone now, nearly 3 weeks out, replaced by the lived-in smell of their 2 lives trying to fit together. It was not a bad smell. It was the smell of effort. He wasn't sure effort was enough. He wasn't sure what was enough. But the morning would come with its requirements regardless, and Montana in late autumn waited for no man's reckoning, and so he went to bed and lay in the dark and listened to the wind work on the cabin and thought, just once more, he told himself, just this once, about a woman he had no right to miss. He missed her anyway. The Silver Creek Autumn Gathering happened every year in the third week of October, in the open ground behind Hallett's feed store, and it was less a celebration than a necessity. The kind of event that frontier communities produce not because anyone particularly wants to stand in the cold and make conversation, but because the alternative is spending the whole winter without having looked your neighbors in the face. Colt had gone every year since he'd arrived in the territory. I went for the same reason everyone went, because isolation was a thing that crept up on a man quietly, and the gathering was one of the few moments in the year when you could take stock of who was still standing. This year he went with Vivian on his arm, and the experience of walking into that gathering as part of a pair was strange enough that he kept noticing it. The way people's eyes moved from him to her and back, the way the Duffy wife came over immediately and took Vivian's hands in hers and said, "We've been so curious about you, my dear," with a warmth that was mostly genuine and only a little acquisitive. Vivian handled it the way she handled most things, with steady, quiet composure and just enough warmth to keep people from feeling rebuffed. He introduced her. He poured her cider from the communal jug. He stood beside her and answered questions about the ranch and the winter stores and the bull he'd replaced, and he did all of it correctly and felt, through the whole of it, slightly outside of himself. Like he was watching a man who looked like him do a reasonable impression of belonging. It was Hallett's boy, 12 years old, with the situational awareness of a fence post, who pulled Colt aside an hour into the gathering to tell him that the freight wagon from the eastern route had come through that morning with a group of westbound travelers, and that they were camped for the night down by the Mill Creek, leaving at first light. "Thought you might want to know," the boy said, with absolutely no idea what he was doing to Colt's chest. "Why would I want to know that?" Colt said. The boy shrugged. "Pa said you'd had someone staying at your place a few weeks back. Traveling woman. Thought maybe she was with this group." He wandered off in the direction of the food table without waiting for a response. Colt stood where he was for a moment. He held his cup of cider. He thought about all the reasons why he should go back to Vivian and stand beside her and eat whatever Mrs. Hallett had cooked and ride home in the wagon in the cold dark and go to bed, and in the morning get up and do what a man who had given his word was supposed to do. He thought about these things. He went to find out about the travelers. He told himself he was just going to look. He told himself that was reasonable, that a man could walk down to the Mill Creek and look at a camp of westbound travelers and confirm that she was not among them and come back to the gathering with that settled. It would take 10 minutes, less. He could tell Vivian he'd gone to check on the horses, which were hitched at the far end of the gathering ground and did not need checking. He did not tell Vivian he was going to check on the horses. He just went. The Mill Creek was a 5-minute walk south of the gathering ground, down a slope that turned steep near the bottom and was slippery with frost at this hour. He picked his way down without a lantern, because bringing a lantern would have made it feel too intentional, and arrived at the edge of the camp to find 4 canvas tents, 2 wagons, a decent fire, and 8 or 9 people in various states of rest and conversation. He stood at the edge of the firelight. She was sitting on a supply crate near the fire with her coat buttoned to the throat and a tin cup in both hands, talking to a woman beside her, a younger woman, 17 or 18, who was listening with the slightly overwhelmed expression of someone receiving more information than they'd asked for. Maeve was not looking at him. She was saying something that made the young woman laugh despite herself. He stood there and looked at her and felt the thing in his chest that he'd been telling himself for 3 weeks wasn't a real thing. It was a real thing. She turned her head and saw him. The moment stretched. Neither of them spoke. The fire popped and the young woman glanced over and then read the air well enough to find something to do elsewhere. "Mr. Mercer," Maeve said. She didn't seem surprised. She seemed careful, which was different. "Maeve." He walked to the fire because standing at the edge of it felt theatrical. He stood near the crate. "You're still in Montana." "Barely." She looked at her cup. "The wagon that was supposed to carry us on from Billings had a broken axle. We've been waiting on a replacement for 11 days. A pause. "We leave tomorrow morning." "I heard," he said. She looked up at that. "How?" "Hallett's boy." "Ah." She turned the cup in her hands. "Small territory." "Yes." He sat down on a second crate without being invited because his legs seemed to require it. She watched him do this without comment. Around them, the camp moved on its own business. A man banking a second fire nearby, 2 others checking the wagon wheels. The young woman who'd moved off now, helping an older couple spread blankets. "How is she?" Maeve said. He didn't have to ask who she meant. "She's at the gathering. Vivian is a good woman." "That wasn't what I asked." He looked at the fire. "She's trying," he said. "We both are." Maeve was quiet for a moment. "That's not a bad answer," she said. "It's not a good one either." She didn't argue with that. She drank from her cup, and he sat with his empty hands, and the fire worked between them, and it was the same as it had been in the cabin. The same quality of shared quiet, comfortable in a way he couldn't manufacture with anyone else, and hadn't been able to explain to himself since. "I thought about writing," she said, not looking at him. "I thought about that too." He paused. "Why didn't you?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything seriously. "Because a letter from me to a man engaged to another woman has one meaning," she said, "and I wasn't sure that was the meaning I had. And I didn't want to be the kind of person who sends it anyway just to see what happens." He felt that land somewhere important. She had thought about it. She had decided against it out of a particular kind of integrity. The same integrity she'd had at the gate when she'd shaken his hand and made it nothing more than what it was allowed to be. "I should tell you something," he said. "You don't have to." "I know." He pressed his hands together and looked at the fire. "I haven't been present since you left. Vivian has noticed. She noticed before I did, probably." He stopped. Restarted. "I'm not saying this to make something happen. I'm saying it because you're leaving tomorrow, and it seems wrong to let you go without having said it once." Maeve set her cup down on the ground beside the crate. "Said what exactly?" she said. Her voice was careful, but her eyes were not. "That what happened in those 4 days was not nothing," he said. "For me. I don't know what it was for you, and I'm not asking you to say, but it wasn't nothing." The fire. The wind off the creek. A horse somewhere in the dark shifting its weight. She looked at him for a long moment with the direct, assessing gaze he remembered from the first morning, when she'd stood in the center of his cabin and taken inventory of what was there and what was possible. "No," she said quietly. "It wasn't nothing." He breathed. Neither of them said anything else. There was nothing else that could be said. Not here, not with Vivian 50 yards up the slope at the gathering, not with Maeve's wagon leaving at first light. He stood up from the crate after a moment, and she looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and he thought about a great number of things that he could not do. "I should get back," he said. "Yes," she said. "You should." He went back up the slope. He went back to the gathering. He found Vivian by the cider jug talking to Mrs. Duffy, and stood beside her and put his hand on her elbow, and she looked at him briefly with an expression that was too knowing to be called neutral. She said nothing about it then. She said nothing about it on the ride home. It was only when they were inside, coats off, and she was lighting the lamp on the table that she said, "She was there, wasn't she?" Not a question. He'd stopped expecting questions. "Yes," he said. She stood with the lamp in her hand and her back to him. "Did you speak with her?" "Yes." "And?" He thought about how to answer this. He thought about what Vivian had said 3 weeks ago, that she'd rather know the real shape of a thing. He thought about what she deserved and what he owed her, and how those were different from what he felt, and how the gap between them had been widening since the moment she'd stepped into this cabin and found it smelling of another woman's bread. "I told her it wasn't nothing," he said. "What happened when she was here?" Vivian set the lamp on the table. She stood with her hands at her sides. "And what did she say?" "She said the same." The silence was long enough that he started to say something, and she stopped him with a raised hand. Not angry, just not done. "I need you to not speak for a moment," she said. He didn't speak. She stood there in the lamplight with her hands at her sides and her face doing something private and complex that she wasn't performing for him. He watched her and felt the particular awfulness of being the instrument of someone else's pain when you don't want to be and can't seem to stop. "I'm sorry," he said, when she seemed to have come back to herself. "I know." She sat down at the table. She put both hands flat on the surface, the repaired surface, the seam still visible under the lamp. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what I want." She said it as though this was a slightly surprising activity, as though wanting things was not something she'd given herself full permission for until recently. "Not what I agreed to." Not what seems like the reasonable thing, what I actually want. He sat across from her. And, he said, I want to be somewhere I'm chosen, she said, not accommodated, not honored because someone gave their word, chosen. She met his eyes. Do you understand the difference? Yes, he said, and he did. He understood it better than almost anything else she'd ever said to him. I don't think you can choose me, she said, not while she exists in the back of your mind the way she does. And I don't think it's fair to either of us to keep pretending you might. He looked at his hands on the table. Vivian, I'm not angry, she said. She sounded like she meant it, which was perhaps the most remarkable thing about her. I'm going to be angry later, I expect. Probably when I'm alone. But right now She pressed her fingers against the wood. I'm practical. You know that's what I am. And the practical truth is that I came west for a life, not for this particular life. And I think, her voice steadied, I think I might be able to find one here, in Silver Creek, not at this ranch, but here. He stared at her. You'd stay? I'd try. She was already thinking through it. He could see. The same way she'd worked through the ledger discrepancies, already calculating, already past the grief, and into the next problem. There's no school in Silver Creek. I noticed that immediately. There are 23 children between here and Billings with no formal instruction. I have a teacher's certificate from Cincinnati that I've never used. He sat back. You're serious? I'm always serious. A pause. Something moved across her face that was wry and small and hurt and dignified all at once. That's been established. He looked at her across the repaired table in the lamplight and felt something he hadn't felt before. Not love, not the love he'd been trying to build toward, but something genuine and uncomplicated. Admiration. The real kind. You're a remarkable woman, he said. I know, she said. It would have been nice if you'd been the one to fully appreciate it. She stood. I'll sleep on the arrangement for now. There's no rush for decisions tonight. She went to the bedroom. He sat at the table for a long time. The next morning, he was at the Mill Creek before first light. He told himself on the walk down that he wasn't sure what he was going to say. This was not quite true. He knew what he was going to say. He just hadn't admitted to himself yet that he'd decided to say it. The camp was already stirring. The 2 wagons were being loaded, bedrolls tied, the fire kicked down to coals. Maeve was helping the older couple load their trunk, lifting her end without waiting to be asked, the same as always. She saw him coming. She set down her end of the trunk, said something to the older man, and walked to meet him at the edge of camp. You're leaving, he said, in about an hour. She studied his face. What's happened? She ended it, he said. Vivian, last night, she ended the engagement. Maeve's expression didn't shift the way he might have expected. There was no relief in it, no satisfaction, just careful attention. Is she all right? She said. Vivian is going to be all right, he said. She's more all right than I deserve. Maeve looked at him. And you? He looked at the creek. The water was low for the season, running clear and fast over rounded stones. In a month it would have ice at the edges. I don't want you to get on that wagon, he said. She was quiet. I know that's not a fair thing to put on you, he said. I know you have a brother in California, and you have a plan, and you have… Colt. She said his name the way she said most things. Without ornamentation, just the word itself, placed where it needed to be. He stopped. Tell me something true, she said. Not something about Vivian, and not something about the cabin, and not something about what you need. Something about what you actually believe. He stood in the cold morning air at the edge of a freight camp in Silver Creek, Montana, and thought about what he actually believed. I believe, he said slowly, that you walked through my door on a Tuesday morning and in 4 days you showed me what this ranch could be. What I could be in it. He stopped. And I don't mean the floors or the curtains or the stove. I mean, he shook his head. You looked at something that wasn't much and you treated it like it was worth working on. You treated me like I was worth working on, and I haven't been able to stop thinking about what that means since the day you left. She stood in front of him with the camp moving behind her and her coat buttoned against the cold, and her hair not yet fully pinned for the day, and she looked at him the way she'd looked at the cabin on that first morning, measuring, honest, neither hopeful nor cynical. That's a lot of weight to put on 4 days, she said. I know it is. And what do you want me to do about it? He took a breath. I want you to stay. Not because the ranch needs someone, and not because I need someone in a general sense. He found her eyes and held them. Because I'd like you to stay. Because I'd like to find out whether what happened in those 4 days is something that can grow into something real, and I can't do that if you're in California. The camp was almost ready. The older couple had their trunk loaded. The younger woman was already on the wagon bench. The driver was checking the harnesses. Maeve looked at the wagon. She looked at Colt. She looked at the creek. My brother is expecting me, she said. I know. I'd have to write him. Yes. And I'd need somewhere to stay that isn't your ranch, not right away. He thought about it. Mrs. Alderman takes boarders in town. $2 a week. She raised an eyebrow. You know that offhand? I was thinking last night, he said. She looked at him for another long moment. He held it. He was a man who was very good at waiting for things. He'd waited 6 years out here for a life to materialize. But this was the hardest wait he could remember. I'm not going to be a consolation prize, she said. You're not, he said, and I'm not going to stay because you asked me to and then feel trapped here if it doesn't work. If it doesn't work, he said, I'll pay your passage to California myself. She looked at him, assessing. He didn't look away. That's a fair offer, she said. I try, he said. She turned back toward the camp. I need to speak with the driver, she said. And she walked toward the wagon, and he stood at the edge of the creek and felt his heart beat in a way that was undignified and unavoidable. She spoke to the driver for 3 minutes. He couldn't hear the words. The driver looked over at Colt once, with the evaluating squint of a man who has seen a lot of human decisions made at freight camps and holds no illusions about their long-term success rates. Maeve said something else. The driver shrugged and began rearranging the load. She came back to Colt with her canvas bag in her hand. I'll need to write Caleb today, she said. The post goes out Friday. I'll walk you to the post office, he said. We're not walking anywhere together until I've had breakfast, she said. Is there somewhere in Silver Creek that can produce a reasonable meal at this hour? Hallett's wife, he said. She starts early. Good. She shifted the bag on her shoulder. And Colt. She said his name in the same way she'd said it before, plain, placed right. I'm staying because I think it's worth finding out. Not because of the 4 days, not because I'm sentimental, because I think you might be someone worth the trouble. I might disappoint you, he said. You probably will at some point, she said. So will I. She started up the slope toward town. That's not the same as not being worth it. He stood for one more moment at the edge of the creek, in the cold first light, and felt something shift in the same place that had shifted on that first morning when she'd stood in his doorway and told him he was a fool. Different this time, lighter. He went after her. Vivian was in the kitchen when he came back to the ranch that afternoon. She had the breadboard out. Mrs. Duffy had apparently come through on the biscuit instruction, and she was working the dough with the focused frown of someone doing a technical thing correctly for the first time. She looked up when he came in. She stayed, Vivian said. It wasn't a question. She's boarding at Alderman's, he said. In town. Vivian worked the dough twice more and set it to rest. She wiped her hands on the towel. She stood with her back against the counter for a moment, and he thought she was going to say something difficult, and prepared himself for it. Will you help me find a building? She said. For the school. I'll need something with a good stove and at least 2 windows, and I can't very well walk around town asking strangers. You know people. He blinked. Yes, he said. Of course. I was thinking the old assay office on Front Street. It's been empty since the spring. Do you know who owns it? Branscombe Estate. There's a nephew in Billings. She nodded. She filed this away. I'll need to write him. She went back to the dough. You can stay at the ranch through winter if the terms are agreeable. I'll need somewhere to live while the school is established. After that, she pressed her lips together. After that, I expect I'll find something in town. Vivian, he said. Don't, she said, gently. I know what you're going to say, and you've said it, and I believe you mean it. I just need... She didn't finish that sentence. She started a new one. I need to make a biscuit that isn't terrible. That's all I need right now. He understood. He went out to the barn and gave her the kitchen. The weeks that followed were strange in the way that things are strange when they are real rather than imagined. No part of it was clean. Maeve came out to the ranch twice in the first week. Once to help him assess the winter pasture. because she had asked and he had no reason to refuse, and once because the fence post they'd driven together in October had shifted in the early frost, and she'd seen it from the road and stopped without being asked to. Vivian was in town both times, which was mostly coincidence and partly not. He and Maeve did not behave foolishly. They were careful with each other, careful in the way that people are careful when what they're handling matters more than convenience. She did not pretend that she'd stopped calculating, and he did not pretend that the ground was more solid than it was. They ate supper at Hallett's twice with a table between them and the Hallett family pretending not to notice, and they talked about the ranch and the winter and the letter from her brother Caleb, who had responded to her news with a paragraph of evident confusion followed by what she described as reluctant good wishes. Was he angry? Colt said. Caleb doesn't get angry, she said. He gets quiet, and then he asks practical questions. He wanted to know your acreage. What did you tell him? I told him I'd let him know when it was relevant. She drank her coffee. He didn't love that answer. Did you? She looked at him over the rim of her cup. I thought it was the honest one, she said. He nodded. He turned his own cup in his hands. Maeve, he said. He said it the way she said his name, direct, placed carefully. I know I can't promise you what this turns into. I know you've come a long way and you're not where you plan to be, and there's no certainty in any of it. I'm aware, she said, but I want you to know that I'm not going to handle this carelessly. He met her eyes. Whatever happens, I'm not going to be careless with you. She looked at him for a long time in the way she looked at things she was seriously considering. I know, she said. That's why I stayed. Outside the Hallett window, Silver Creek moved on its ordinary business. A wagon passing, two men talking in front of the hardware, the early winter sky going gray at the edges. None of it was prepared for what was going to happen to the three people inside it and around it over the months ahead. The territory didn't make announcements about these things. It just kept going and let people find their way or not find it, and waited without patience for spring. Colt walked Maeve back to Alderman's in the cold late afternoon, and they stood at the gate for a moment in the same way they'd stood at his gate that first morning, two strangers measuring the distance between where they were and where they might be. Same time Thursday? He said. Yes, she said. She went inside. He stood at the gate for a moment after the door closed, not as long as he'd stood watching the freight wagon take her away, but long enough. Long enough to feel that the ground under his feet, which had felt uncertain since October, had something in it that hadn't been there before. Not solid yet, not settled, but something. He turned up his collar against the wind and started the 4-mile ride back to the ranch, and the territory stretched out around him in every direction, wide and cold and indifferent, and he rode through it feeling, for the first time since she'd shaken his hand and walked away, like he was going somewhere. Winter came to Montana that year the way it always did, without apology and ahead of schedule. The first serious snow fell in the second week of November, 3 inches overnight, that turned the pasture into something flat and white and deceptively quiet. Colt was up before it finished, checking the cattle, counting heads in the gray pre-dawn with the snow still coming down soft and steady. He lost count twice because his hands were too cold to work the tally stick properly, and he had to start over, which was the kind of small frontier humiliation that nobody ever wrote about, but that accumulated over a winter into something that wore on a man. He didn't mind it. That was the truth he'd discovered about himself over 6 Montana winters. He was built for this kind of difficulty. The grinding, repetitive, physical kind. It was the other kind that undid him. Maeve came out on Thursday as she'd said she would, and then on the following Tuesday without being asked, because she'd been in the road past the north pasture and seen the new fence post had healed over again in the frozen ground. She arrived at the barn door with a post-hole digger over one shoulder and her coat dusted with snowflakes, and said, "That post won't hold until spring if you don't reset it deeper," which was true, and they reset it together in the cold, and afterward she came inside and made coffee while he changed his wet gloves, and the cabin felt like the cabin again, the right way. This became a pattern without either of them formally establishing it. She came out 2 or 3 times a week. Sometimes there was specific work, a fence, a stove adjustment, a calculation about the winter feed supply that she worked out on paper faster than he could have managed in his head. Sometimes there wasn't particular work, and they simply found it anyway, because the ranch always had something that needed doing, and two people who weren't afraid of it could always find a use for an afternoon. He was careful. He had told her he would be careful, and he meant it. There were moments when careful was harder than others. When she laughed at something unexpected and the laugh was so unself-conscious that it caught him off guard, or when she'd worked herself to the point of real exhaustion and didn't admit it until she sat down and he saw it in the set of her shoulders. But he held the line. He did not rush. He had the feeling, which he trusted, that with Maeve Rowan rushing would be the single most effective way to destroy whatever was building between them. She was, as she'd said, not sentimental. She did not soften the edges of things to make them easier to receive. When the North Pasture drainage problem came up in December and he suggested a solution that would have cost him 3 days of work, she sat with his sketch for 5 minutes and then told him it was wrong, that it would redirect the runoff into the barn foundation, and he'd be worse off in spring than he was now. He'd looked at her correction and seen she was right, and felt an emotion he couldn't quite name, something adjacent to gratitude but bigger, like being handed back a version of yourself that could do better. He wrote to her brother Caleb, not because Maeve asked him to, she didn't, but because it seemed like the honest thing. He introduced himself in writing the way he'd introduced himself in his letter to Vivian, direct, functional, without embellishment. He explained the situation as plainly as he could. He did not ask for permission, because that wasn't what the letter was about. He just thought the man deserved to know the shape of things. Caleb wrote back in 3 weeks. The letter was 4 sentences long. The third sentence said, "Maeve has always made her own decisions, and they have generally been better than mine." The fourth said, "If you're careless with her, I'll find a way to make the trip." Colt read this twice and felt he understood Caleb Rowan without needing to meet him. He showed the letter to Maeve. She read it and said, "That sounds about right," and handed it back. Vivian, meanwhile, had found the assay office. The Branscombe nephew and Billings had agreed to a lease at a rate that Vivian had clearly negotiated down from whatever he'd first proposed, because when she told Colt the number, he said, "That's reasonable," and she said, "It's better than reasonable. It's what the space is actually worth," which was the Vivian Hale approach to most things, and which he had come to genuinely respect. She spent December cleaning the building and January furnishing it. She had almost no money. She'd arrived in Montana with enough to sustain herself for 3 months, carefully planned, and the furnishing was therefore a project of ingenuity rather than purchasing. The Duffys donated 2 long tables. The Hallets produced a wood stove from a storage shed that had been sitting unused for 4 years. Colt drove a load of firewood into town without being asked and stacked it outside her door, and she appeared in the doorway while he was doing it and said, "I didn't ask for that," and he said, "No," and continued stacking, and she went back inside and he heard the sound of furniture being moved around. She opened the school in February with 9 students. By March, she had 14. He saw her when he came to town, which was once a week for supplies and occasionally more. They had developed a civil and specific friendship. Not the warmth of people who had been through something good together, but the particular warmth of people who had been through something difficult together, and had both come out of it without diminishing the other. She was direct with him. He was honest with her. They talked about the school, about the ranch, about the territory's slow political changes as statehood conversation grew louder in the Eastern papers. She didn't talk about what had happened between them. He didn't bring it up. But one afternoon in March, when he'd stopped to leave a book she'd mentioned wanting, he'd found it in a box of the Sacramento papers stuffed in the back, apparently left by the same traveler. She looked at him in the doorway of the schoolhouse with the afternoon light coming through and said, "Are you happy?" He thought about it seriously. "I think I'm getting there," he said. She nodded. "Good," she said. And she meant it. He could tell the difference by now between Vivian meaning something and Vivian performing meaning, and this was the real kind. "She's good for you, in case you wanted the opinion of someone who has no reason to lie to you about it." He didn't know what to say to that. He said, "Thank you," and meant that too. She took the book inside. He went back to the ranch. April was when things got difficult. Not between him and Maeve. There, things had actually found a kind of footing, a daily ease that had moved past the carefulness of those first months into something more natural and more dangerous because of it. Because natural and dangerous are often the same thing when you're trying not to move too fast. No, the difficulty came from outside, from the territory itself,
which had been waiting all winter to remind everyone what it could do when it put its mind to it. It started with 3 days of unseasonably warm weather that softened the snowpack and sent water running fast down every slope. And then it froze again hard overnight and then warmed again. And the cycle repeated twice more until the north pasture fence, which they had reset in November and Colt had checked twice in January, gave way along a 40-foot stretch in the middle of a Tuesday night. He found it at dawn. Or rather, he found the empty pasture where 31 head of cattle should have been, and followed the obvious trail in the churned mud to the gap in the fence, and then spent 4 hours tracking them across 3 neighboring properties before he'd recovered 28. The other 3 were gone into the hills or taken. He couldn't tell which. He came home covered in mud and worse. Maeve was at the cabin. She'd been there since early morning, working on the winter supply accounts because she had a facility with numbers he'd never argued with. And she looked at him when he came through the door and said, "How many?" 28 back, he said. 3 gone. She was already standing. The gap in the north fence? 40 feet, maybe more. The ground heaved. "I'll get the tools," she said. "Maeve, get changed," she said. "We can argue about it while we work." They didn't actually argue about it. He changed. She had the post hole digger and the wire cutters and the splice kit at the fence line before he got there, and they worked the rest of the morning into the afternoon without stopping. And the fence that went back up was better than the one that had come down because she saw a way to anchor the corner post with a diagonal brace he hadn't tried before and insisted on it, despite his initial skepticism. "It'll hold better than what you had," she said. "You don't know that yet." "I know the physics of it," she said. He did not argue with the physics. He drove the brace. That evening they were both so tired they barely spoke at supper. She'd stayed because it was too late to ride back to town with any safety, and he had a spare room, and he fell asleep in his chair by the fire and woke to find a blanket had been draped over him, and the lamp turned down, and Maeve gone to the spare room. He sat in the dark for a moment with the blanket around his shoulders and thought about what it meant that this had happened simply and without comment, without ceremony, without anything other than the ordinary human recognition that a tired person is better with a blanket than without one. He thought it meant something quite specific. He wasn't ready to say it out loud yet, but he thought it. May brought the thaw, and with it 3 things in quick succession. The first was Duffy. Warren Duffy had been Colt's nearest neighbor for 5 years and had never been anything other than a study in aggressive cordiality. The kind of man who slapped your back at the gathering and tried to buy your land twice a year and genuinely could not see any contradiction between these behaviors. He arrived at the ranch on a Thursday morning in early May on his best horse, which was always a signal that the visit was not casual. Colt saw him coming from the north pasture and walked to meet him at the gate. "Mercer," Duffy said. He stayed on the horse, which was another signal. "Heard you lost some cattle in the April thaw." 3 head, Colt said. "Recovered 28. "Hard winter," Duffy said, with the sympathy of a man who has not had a hard winter. "How are the numbers looking?" "Fine," Colt said. "Heard you've had help." Duffy's eyes moved past Colt toward the cabin with the particular idleness that means they're not actually idle. "The woman from Mrs. Alderman's. Rowan, is it?" "That's right," Colt said. "Interesting arrangement," Duffy said. He said it with a smile that he probably thought was genial. "Given the other situation, the Hale woman." "The school is going well," Colt said. "If you're asking about Miss Hale." "I'm not asking about Miss Hale." Duffy shifted in his saddle. "I'm asking about you, Mercer. Whether you're managing, man in your situation, broken engagement, ranch running short on hands. Sometimes it makes more sense to consolidate than to struggle." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm prepared to offer you a fair price." "You've offered twice before," Colt said. The answer was the same both times. "Circumstances change. Mine haven't." Duffy looked at him with the evaluating patience of a man who believes all resistance is eventually negotiable. "The Rowan woman," he said. "She's not local. People talk, you know how it is. Man living alone, woman coming and going from his property. There's a version of that story that makes things complicated." Colt stood at his gate in the May morning and felt something go very quiet and very cold in him. It was the kind of quiet that he'd learned to recognize in himself during the war. Not anger exactly, but the place below anger where decisions got made. "Say that clearly," he said, "so we understand each other." Duffy seemed to hear something in the register of it. He recalibrated, visibly.
I just mean that the territory has opinions, he said. I'm trying to look out for you. You're trying to buy my land, Colt said. You're not trying to look out for me, and if you bring Maeve Rowan's name into it again, I'm going to tell you to get off my property and mean it in a way I haven't meant it before. He put his hand on the gatepost. Is there anything else? Duffy looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man repricing his estimate. Not today, he said. He turned the horse and rode back the way he came. Colt stood at the gate until Duffy was well down the road. Then he went back inside. Maeve was at the table. She had heard. The window was open a hand's width for the spring air, and she had heard, and she was sitting with her hands flat on the table in the way she sat when she was deciding something. You didn't have to do that, she said. Yes, I did, he said. She looked at her hands. People are going to talk regardless. People can talk about whatever they like, he said. That's not the same as me standing at my own gate and letting him use your name that way. She was quiet for a moment. When she looked up, her expression was not soft exactly. Maeve's expressions were rarely soft, but it had something in it that he hadn't seen directed at him before. Something unguarded. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me for a thing that should be obvious, he said, and went to put the coffee on. Oh. The second thing Maeve brought was a storm. Not the worst storm he'd seen in Montana. The worst had been 3 winters back, when he'd lost the roof on the eastern lean-to and a fence had come down across the creek. But it was bad. 3 days of it, wind and rain that turned the roads to trenches, the temperature dropping 30 degrees in 6 hours. Maeve had come out on the first morning before the worst of it hit to help him move the remaining cattle to the upper sheltered pasture, and then the storm came faster than either of them had expected, and she couldn't safely ride back. 3 days at the ranch. Not something either of them had planned. The first day they worked, securing the barn, reinforcing the roof of the lean-to against the wind, hauling water before the creek ran too fast to approach. The second day they were confined inside and did what people confined inside during a 3-day storm eventually do. They talked. Not about feelings. Nothing as neat as that. They talked about Ohio and the war and the particular loneliness of being the oldest child in a household that needs managing. He told her about the 2 years after the war when he'd drifted without fixing on anything, when he'd worked 3 different operations and left all 3, not because anything had gone wrong, but because nothing had gone right. She told him about the summer she was 23 when she'd almost married a man from Columbus. A good man, she said, genuinely decent. She had nothing against him. But she'd stood in front of him in her mother's kitchen and understood with complete clarity that she was about to choose smallness because smallness was what was being offered. And she'd told him no, and he'd been confused and hurt, and she'd spent 8 months second-guessing herself and then stopped second-guessing. Why did you stop? Colt said. Because my mother asked me what I would have been if I'd said yes, she said, and I couldn't answer. She looked at the fire. She said, if you can't picture yourself in that life, it's not because you can't picture yourself with him. It's because that life was never yours. He sat with that for a while. Your mother was a wise woman, he said. She was practical, Maeve said. I get it from her. A pause. I miss her every day. He thought about his own mother, about the 11-year-old boy he'd been when he lost her, and how that loss had sealed something in him that had taken 23 years to begin to open. He didn't say all of that. He said, I understand missing someone like that. And she looked at him in the way she looked at him when she believed him, which was different from her looking at him generally. The third day the storm broke and she rode back to town in the early afternoon on roads that were a mess but passable, and he watched her go from the porch the way he'd watched the freight wagon take her away in October, except that this time he knew she'd be back on Tuesday. It was a different kind of watching. The third thing May brought arrived at the end of the month in the form of a letter that had taken 6 weeks to reach Silver Creek from its origin in a law office in Billings. It was addressed to all landowners in the Silver Creek Basin, and its language was careful in the way that language is careful when it is trying to mean something other than what it says. The gist of it was this. A land consolidation company called Heron Valley Properties was acquiring parcels in the territory for purposes of large-scale cattle operation, and was prepared to offer fair market value to interested sellers, and would be sending a representative to Silver Creek in June to discuss terms with any parties who wished to engage. Colt read it twice and set it on the table. Maeve read it once. Heron Valley, she said. Never heard of them. Neither have I. She turned the letter over. The back was blank. She turned it face up again. Billings Law Office. No individual names on the letterhead, just the company. She looked at the return address. That's interesting? Why interesting? Because legitimate land buyers usually want you to know who they are, she said. They want you to be able to look them up, ask around, confirm they're real. Anonymous buyers want the opposite. She set the letter down. How many other ranchers in the basin got this? Duffy, probably, he said. Hallett has land south of the creek. There's a widow, Mrs. Crane, east of town. Probably 8 or 10 operations total. And Duffy just tried to buy you out. He looked at her. She was looking at the letter. You think he's connected, he said. I think it's worth asking, she said. I think a man who shows up on your property pushing a sale and then a letter arrives from an anonymous company offering the same thing isn't a coincidence worth ignoring. She tapped the letter. I'd like to know who Heron Valley Properties actually is. How would we find out? Billings has a land records office, she said. Companies that operate in the territory have to register. There'll be names on that registration. He looked at her. You know a lot about land registration. My father had a dispute about a boundary survey when I was 19, she said. I spent a summer learning more about property law than I ever wanted to know. She folded the letter and handed it back to him. Write to the Billings Records Office. Ask for the registered principals of Heron Valley Properties. He wrote the letter that evening. He paid the express post from his own pocket, which cost more than regular mail, but would arrive faster. June came and the Heron Valley representative arrived in Silver Creek on a Tuesday, which Colt found irritating because Tuesday was when Maeve came out to the ranch and he had to go into town to deal with this instead. The representative was a man named Aldrich, no first name offered, which told Colt something, who wore a good coat and bad boots and set up in the back room of Hallett's feed store to conduct his interviews. Colt was the 4th rancher to see him that day. He sat across from Aldrich with his hat on his knee and listened to the offer, which was framed very carefully as a generous opportunity, and asked 3 questions. The first, who were the principals of Heron Valley Properties? Aldrich said that information was proprietary to the company's internal structure. The second, what were the specific terms of the proposed acquisition? Aldrich said he wasn't in a position to discuss specific terms until a seller had expressed intent. The third, what was the company's plan for the land after acquisition? Aldrich said large-scale cattle operation, which was what the letter had said, and said it in the tone of a man repeating a prepared answer. Colt put his hat back on. I'm not interested, he said. Aldrich's expression did something practiced and regretful. I'd encourage you to think carefully, Mr. Mercer. The territory is changing. Small operations find it difficult. I'm not interested, Colt said again. He stood. Thank you for your time. He walked back out through the feed store and found Maeve waiting on the front step. She'd come to town, apparently, because she'd wanted to see the representative herself. Well, she said. Anonymous, he said. Proprietary structure, no names, prepared answers. He glanced back at the door. He'll be in there all afternoon. I know, she said. I spoke with Mrs. Crane this morning. She was the second one in. She said the offer was substantial enough that she's thinking seriously about it. She looked at the feed store front. If he gets enough of the basin, the ones who don't sell become unviable. He doesn't need all of them, just enough. Colt understood this. He'd seen it once before in Kansas, before he'd come north. A company buying up parcels until the remaining landowners couldn't access the water routes or the grazing grounds they'd depended on and had to sell anyway. Worse terms, no choice. We need the registration names, he said. The letter from Billings came this morning, she said. She reached into her coat pocket. She'd gone to the post office first. He took the letter. He opened it. He read the list of registered principals for Heron Valley Properties. The second name on the list was Warren Duffy. He stood on the step of Hallett's feed store in the June morning and looked at that name for a long moment. Well, he said. Yes, Maeve said. He folded the letter. He wants the water rights, he said. The north pasture runs to the creek. If he gets my land and Crane's land and 2 or 3 others, he controls the basin water access. Which makes the remaining properties worth considerably less, she said. And then he buys those too. She looked at the road running through Silver Creek's small main street. He's been planning this for a while. He's offered to buy me out twice, Colt said. I thought it was just greed. It is greed, she said. It's organized greed. She looked at him. What do you want to do? He looked at the letter. He thought about Mrs. Crane, who was a widow with 2 grown sons and land she'd held for 12 years. He thought about the Hallett family, who had been in the basin longer than Duffy and knew it better. He thought about what happened to small ranchers when someone with enough capital decided they were an obstacle. I want to talk to every landowner in this basin before Aldrich does, he said, and I want to do it today. I'll take the east side of the creek, she said. She was already moving. You take the west. He didn't argue. He went west. They spent the rest of that day riding separately and covering the basin, and what they found was a community that was worried in the way communities are worried when something feels wrong and they don't yet have the name for it. Most of the landowners had received the letter. Several had already met with Aldrich. One, a family named Peterson with a small operation south of town, had already verbally agreed to sell, which was not yet binding but would become so quickly. By evening, Colt and Maeve had spoken to 11 landowners. By evening, 7 of those 11 had agreed to hold and to meet together to discuss a coordinated response. By evening, Maeve had drafted in her neat, functional handwriting a letter to the Territorial Land Office in Helena, identifying Duffy by name as a principal of the company attempting to acquire the basin, which was not illegal but was the kind of thing that required disclosure when a party was also operating as a neighboring landowner with existing disputes, and the 2 attempted buyouts of Colt's property constituted a documented existing dispute, which Colt had quietly recorded in his own ledger each time, and which he now pulled out and showed to the assembled ranchers at Hallett's table that evening. Duffy was not invited. This is what he was doing, Colt said, laying the letter and his ledger records on the table. He's been trying to buy me quietly while his company moves in the front door. If he gets the properties with creek access, the rest of us can't function. The room looked at the documents. Mrs. Crane, who had been the most tempted by the offer, sat with her hands folded and read everything twice. What do we do? Hallett said. We don't sell, Colt said. Individually or collectively. And we report the conflict of interest to Helena, so there's a record. He looked around the table. He can't force anyone. He can only wait for people to feel desperate enough to agree. If we hold together, he can't create that desperation. It took another 2 hours of conversation, and not everyone at the table felt equally certain, and Mrs. Crane did not fully commit until Maeve laid out the water access mathematics on paper in terms that made the long-term consequence of selling undeniably clear. But by the time Hallett's wife cleared the coffee cups, the group had agreed on enough to constitute a real response. They would hold, they would write to Helena, and they would meet again in 2 weeks to assess. Walking out into the night air after, Maeve beside him, Colt felt the particular exhaustion of having done something that mattered. Crane almost went, he said. The numbers swayed her, Maeve said. She's a practical woman. You're good at that, he said, putting it in terms people can't argue with. She walked beside him in the dark main street of Silver Creek and didn't answer immediately. He'd noticed she did this, didn't fill silence just to fill it, let things sit until she knew what she actually thought. I've spent a lot of my life having to prove things to people who'd already decided not to believe me, she said. You learn to make the numbers do the talking instead. He thought about what that meant, what it cost, over time, to have to work twice as hard to be heard. He didn't say this because she didn't need him to say it. She knew what it cost. They believed you tonight, he said. They believed the numbers, she said. The numbers came from you, he said. She looked at him sidelong in the dark. Don't make it romantic, she said. It's arithmetic. All right, he said. But he was smiling, and she saw it, and she looked away. And he thought she was possibly smiling too, though he couldn't verify this in the dark. They reached the point where the road forked, left to Alderman's, right back toward the ranch. He stopped. She stopped. He'd been careful for 7 months. He'd held the line and meant to hold it. But 7 months of watching someone be exactly who they were, in hard weather and bad circumstances, and the grinding daily demands of a Montana winter, 7 months of seeing her choose integrity over ease and honesty over comfort, and still manage to find the dry, funny thing in a bad situation. 7 months of that had a weight to it that was not nothing. Maeve, he said. She turned and looked at him. There was no preamble. He was not a man given to preamble. I need to say something, and I want to say it before I've thought about it long enough to say it wrong. She waited. I'm not in this, he said. Because you fixed my stove, or because you know how to drive a fence post, or because you can read a land registration document faster than any lawyer I've met. He stopped. Restarted.
Those things are real and I value them, but that's not why. Why then? She said. Careful. But her eyes were direct. Because you are the most fully honest person I have ever spent time with, he said. And because you make me want to be that too. He looked at her in the dark main street of Silver Creek with the spring wind moving past them both. And I think I love you. I think I've been working toward that sentence since October, and I'd rather say it plainly than keep waiting for the perfect moment, because I've been waiting for the perfect moment for most of my life, and it turns out it doesn't come. The moment just comes. The wind. A horse shifting somewhere down the road. The lamplight from Alderman's window falling across the mud of the street. Maeve looked at him for a long time without speaking. He held it. He was good at waiting. You said, I think, she said. I don't think, he said. I know. I said, I think, because I was nervous. Something moved across her face that he had never seen there before. Not the private smile, not the assessing look, not the concentrated focus she gave to problems. Something open. Something that cost her. I'm not easy, she said. You know that. I know, he said, and I'm not going to be different than I am because we're saying this out loud. I don't want you different, he said. She breathed in the night air slowly. She looked at the lamplit fork in the road. Then she looked at him. I know you, she said. 7 months. Through a Montana winter and a fence collapse and Duffy and that storm in May. She paused. I know you, Colt Mercer. And I think you might be the thing I was going toward when I got off that freight wagon. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. I love you too. I've known it for a while. I was waiting to be sure you meant it. He took her hand. She let him. They stood at the fork in the road in the May dark of Silver Creek, and the territory stretched out around them in every direction, indifferent and enormous, and full of what was still to come. And neither of them said anything else because there was nothing else that needed saying right then. Some things don't need more words than they've already been given. He walked her to Alderman's gate. She went inside. He rode back to the ranch in the dark with the spring night around him and the knowledge of what had just happened sitting in his chest like something that had finally found the space it was meant to occupy. The cabin was dark when he got home. He lit the lamp. He stood in the center of the clean floor, cleaner now than when she'd first seen it, a different kind of clean, the clean of a place that was lived in and cared for, and looked at the curtains and the stove and the repaired table and thought about a Tuesday morning in October when a woman had stood in this doorway and called him a fool. She'd been right then. She'd been right about most things. He sat down at the table and let himself be still for a while, which was not something he was usually good at, but which felt possible tonight in a way it hadn't for a very long time. Outside, the Montana Spring was doing what Montana Spring did, moving through the dark, changing things without asking, turning the difficult ground towards something that might eventually hold. The letter from Helena arrived on a Wednesday, which was not a day Maeve usually came out to the ranch, but she was there anyway because the Territorial Land Office had sent a copy to every landowner who had signed the joint complaint, and she'd come to compare what hers said against what Colt's said. They were identical. That was the first thing. Word for word, which meant the office had taken the complaint seriously enough to treat all parties as equally involved, which was not something Colt had been certain would happen. Territorial bureaucracies had their own sense of priority, and small ranchers in a basin dispute were not always at the top of it. He spread both letters on the table and they stood side by side and read them. The office had received the complaint. The office had reviewed the registration documents for Heron Valley properties. The office confirmed that Warren Duffy's status as a registered principal of Heron Valley, while simultaneously operating as an adjacent landowner engaged in direct purchase negotiations with potential acquisition targets, constituted a conflict requiring formal disclosure under territorial land law. Heron Valley's representative, Aldrich, had been notified that all pending agreements required disclosure of this conflict before they could be executed. The Peterson family's verbal agreement, which had been the one Colt had worried most about, was confirmed as non-binding pending this disclosure. An investigator would be sent from Helena within 30 days. Maeve set the letter down.
She put her hands flat on the table. 30 days, she said. That's faster than I expected, he said. It means they think it's real, she said. If they thought it was a nuisance complaint, they'd sit on it for 60. He looked at Duffy's name on the registration document, which was still lying there from the night at Hallett's table. He thought about the slap on the back at the gathering, year after year. He thought about 2 buyout attempts framed as neighborly concern. He's going to know we were the ones who filed, he said. Yes, she said. He won't like it. No. She picked up the letter and folded it. He'll come here. He'll try to resolve it quietly before the investigator arrives. She said this as a statement of fact, which it was. They both knew Duffy well enough by now to read his next move. Let him come, Colt said. He came on Friday. He did not come on his best horse this time. He came in a wagon, which was a different kind of signal. Less authority, more negotiation. He pulled up to the gate and Colt was already on the porch, and Maeve was inside and stayed inside, which was her decision, and he didn't second-guess it. Duffy got down from the wagon. He stood at the gate without opening it, which was the first thing that had changed. You filed with Helena, he said. I did, Colt said. You should have come to me first. I didn't see what that would have accomplished, Colt said. You'd been to me twice with a purchase offer. You didn't tell me either time that you had a financial interest in the company also making offers in this basin. That's not an oversight. That's a choice. Duffy's jaw worked for a moment. He was a large man, wide-faced, used to filling a room with his physical presence in a way that was not quite threatening, but was not quite not. It didn't work as well outdoors. It's legal, he said. The conflict wasn't disclosed, Colt said. That part isn't legal. That's what Helena said. Helena can be managed, Duffy said. He said it the way men say things they've said before to good effect, and Colt thought about all the conversations Duffy had probably had where that line worked, where the person on the other side was scared enough or isolated enough to hear it as fact rather than bluster. Maybe, Colt said. But the Hallett family has filed now too, and Mrs. Crane and 4 others. He looked at Duffy across the gate. You're not managing 11 landowners and a territorial investigation. You're managing a mistake. Duffy stood there for a moment in the May morning with the prairie behind him and his wagon and his best arguments apparently used up. He looked older than he had in October, or maybe Colt was just seeing him more clearly. This land is worth twice what you think, Duffy said. It came out with less force than he'd intended. I know what it's worth, Colt said. I built it. The same answer he'd given before. Duffy heard the echo of it. He got back in his wagon. He turned it around without another word and drove back down the road, and Colt watched him go with the same flatness he felt after any unpleasant but necessary thing. Not satisfaction, just the absence of an ongoing problem. Maeve came out to the porch when the wagon was out of sight. He'll try someone else next, she said. He will, Colt agreed. But the others know now, and Helena knows. He looked at the road. He might still find a way through. I'm not pretending this is over. It's not over, she said, but it's different than it was. She stood beside him on the porch, and they both looked at the road for a moment. You didn't raise your voice, she said. Nothing to raise it about. Facts don't need volume. She looked at him sidelong. You've gotten better at that. At what? Knowing which things need force and which things need patience. She went back inside. Coffee's ready. He followed her in. The Helena investigator arrived in the 3rd week of June. A compact woman named Marsh, 50s, with a leather satchel that looked like it had been to every corner of the territory and a manner that made it clear she'd heard every version of every land dispute and had opinions about all of them that she wasn't going to share. She spent 4 days in Silver Creek. She interviewed 11 landowners. She reviewed the registration documents, the purchase offer letters, the correspondence between Colt's ledger records, and the timeline of Heron Valley's basin activity. She spent one afternoon at the old assay office that was now Vivian's school, apparently, though what she wanted there Colt wasn't certain. On the 4th day, she sat across from Colt and Maeve at Hallett's table. Hallett had offered the back room and they'd accepted, and laid out what she'd found. Heron Valley Properties was registered to 5 principals, Duffy among them. The company had been active in the territory for 14 months, which meant it had existed before Duffy's second purchase attempt on Colt's land, which made the non-disclosure not an oversight but a pattern. The Peterson agreement, still unexecuted, had been structured in a way that would have given Heron Valley Creek access before any other purchase was complete, meaning the Petersons would have effectively enabled the next phase without understanding what they were enabling. "What happens to Duffy?" Colt said. Marsh looked at her documents. "He'll be required to divest from Heron Valley or from his own adjacent land holdings. He can't hold both positions in an active acquisition zone. The territorial statute is clear." She paused. "He'll likely sell the Heron Valley stake. It's worth more to him as a silent partner than the alternative." "And the other principles?" "The company can continue to operate if they disclose correctly going forward," she said. "They cannot make offers in this basin without full disclosure to every party." She closed her satchel. "The Peterson situation concerns me. They're a young family. They were not given accurate information." "Will they be protected?" Maeve said. Marsh looked at her for a moment with the evaluating attention she'd given everything else. "I'll recommend it," she said. "I can't guarantee the outcome. That's above my jurisdiction." She stood. "What I can tell you is that the record is now complete and that anyone trying to proceed without full compliance is doing so in writing, which makes them much easier to hold accountable." She left the next morning. Colt didn't know what would happen next with Duffy or with Heron Valley, and he said so to Maeve on the ride home that evening. "We did what we could do," she said. "That's all anyone can do." "Does it feel like enough?" She thought about it honestly. "It feels like the right amount of fight for the right reason," she said. "The outcome isn't ours to control." She looked at the road ahead. The Petersons might still sell. Duffy might find another way. The territory might change in ways that make all of it moot in 20 years. She paused. But the basin landowners sat at a table together and held. That matters regardless of what comes after. He thought she was right. He thought about the table at Hallett's and Mrs. Crane reading the water access numbers twice and the Hallett family pulling that wood stove out of storage for Vivian's school. He thought about the ways a community was built, not from one dramatic act, but from accumulated small ones, each imperfect, each counting. He thought, this is what she understood from the beginning, that you work on what's in front of you with the tools you have, and you treat it like it's worth working on, and sometimes that's enough and sometimes it isn't, but it's all you've got. He thought he'd been learning that lesson since October, and still wasn't finished with it. Well, July arrived with heat and the particular relentlessness of a Montana summer that doesn't apologize for the winter it's replacing. The cattle were on the summer pasture. The garden Colt had largely neglected for 3 years was producing in a way it hadn't before because Maeve had reorganized it in April with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, and the ranch felt, he had to use the word, even knowing it was imprecise, settled. Not finished. A ranch was never finished. There was always the next fence and the next weather system and the next calculation about whether the hay stores would carry through to spring. But settled. Like a house that has found its foundation. Vivian's school had 21 students by midsummer. He knew this because she told him when he came to town, and because the whole of Silver Creek knew it in the way small communities know the statistics of their own survival. A school was not nothing on the frontier. A school was a statement of intent, that people planned to stay, that they believed staying was worth something, that the children of the basin had a future that extended past whatever the next hard winter brought. She had moved out of the old assay office in June into a small house on the east side of town. 2 rooms, a decent stove, a kitchen garden she was establishing with advice she'd apparently solicited from Maeve, which was a development Colt found quietly extraordinary. He didn't say anything about it. Some things were better left to grow on their own terms. The friendship between the 2 women was not easy and not false. He'd been aware of it building through the spring in small, practical exchanges. Maeve's drainage solution applied to Vivian's garden. Vivian's accounting instinct applied to the joint complaint documents. The 2 of them sitting at Hallett's on a Tuesday afternoon he hadn't been there to see but heard about from Hallett's wife, who described it as like watching 2 people discover they've been reading the same book. It made sense to him, in the way things made sense in retrospect. They were both women who had come west looking for something real and found it in forms they hadn't anticipated. They had both, in their different ways, chosen the harder thing over the easier one. That kind of experience creates a particular recognition between people. He stayed out of it. It was not his to manage. What was his to manage was the question he'd been carrying since May, which was not whether he wanted to marry Maeve Rowan. He knew the answer to that with the same quiet certainty. He knew which pasture drained badly and which way the wind came before a storm, but when and how to ask in a way that was honest rather than romantic in the hollow sense. He'd watched men ask women to marry them in the hollow sense. He'd seen the aftermath. The ceremony was a fine thing, and then morning came and the question still remained. What are we actually doing here, and is it real, and did we choose it clearly? He wanted to choose it clearly. He wanted her to choose it clearly. He did not want the moment to be about the moment. So he waited until August. It was a Tuesday, which had become the reliable architecture of his week, the day that organized everything else around it. She'd come out in the morning to go over the summer accounts, the hay stores projections, the cattle tallies, the question of whether to expand the herd by 6 head before winter or wait until spring. These were real questions with real consequences, and they worked through them at the table for 2 hours and came to conclusions that were sound if not certain, the way most real conclusions are. Afterward, she made coffee, because she made coffee when she was satisfied with a morning's work, and he sat across from her at the repaired table. The seam still visible in the wood, still there, still holding, and he looked at her hands around the cup. "I want to ask you something," he said. She looked up. She read his face with the directness she always brought to reading things. "All right," she said. "I'm not going to make a speech about it," he said. "You know what I think about speeches?" "I do." He put his hands on the table. He looked at her. "Maeve, I would like to marry you, not because the ranch needs a partner, and not because the winter is easier with 2 people, and not because of the 4 days in October that started all of this." He stopped, restarted. "Because every hard thing this year has been more bearable with you in it, and every ordinary day has been better. Because you make me think more clearly and feel more honestly and do better work than I do alone." He paused. "And because I would like to spend the rest of my life finding out what else we're capable of together." She held her cup. She looked at him with the assessing gaze that he knew now was not coldness but seriousness, her particular way of giving something the weight it deserved. "That's not a small ask," she said. "No," he agreed. "The ranch is hard. You know that better than anyone. I'm not easy to live with. I know that too. And I'll still tell you when you're wrong," she said. "I'm counting on it," he said. She set the cup down. She looked at the table between them, the seam in the wood, the place where a broken thing had been fixed and was still whole. Then she looked at him. "Yes," she said, simply. The way she said everything important, without ornament, without performance. Just the word itself, placed where it needed to be. He breathed. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers. And they sat like that for a moment in the August morning, with the coffee going warm between them and the curtains moving in the summer air. And it was not a perfect moment, because no moment is. But it was a true one, which is better. They were married in September. Vivian helped plan it, which was her idea and not Colt's suggestion, and which he'd been uncertain about until Maeve told him flatly to stay out of the planning because it was not his area of competence, and she and Vivian had it handled. He stayed out of the planning. The 2 women spent 3 evenings at Vivian's house with a list and a modest budget and produced something that was, he had to admit, better than anything he would have thought of. The church in Silver Creek was small and white-painted and had survived 7 Montana winters without the roof giving in, which was its main distinction and also its main virtue. They married on a Saturday in the middle of September, when the aspens along the creek had gone gold, and the air had the clean particular bite of early autumn, the same season, almost exactly a year later, as the Tuesday morning she'd stood in his doorway and called him a fool. He thought about that while he waited at the front of the church. He thought about the man he'd been that morning, the panic, the bad coffee, the floor he hadn't swept in 3 weeks, the breathtaking unpreparedness for the life he was supposed to be building. He thought about what it had taken to get from that man to this one. It had not been a smooth journey. He had made mistakes specific to him, and he had also made the universal mistakes that people make when they are trying to do something real and are afraid of it. He had hurt Vivian, not through cruelty but through incompleteness, which was its own kind of hurt. He had spent too many months in his own head when he should have been standing in the world. He looked at the people filling the small church, the Halletts, Mrs. Crane, who had held and was still holding, the Peterson family, who had ultimately declined Heron Valley's offer after the Helena investigation had made the terms clear, and who were here because they'd been part of something that mattered. Vivian in the third row, with her hands folded and her posture exactly what it always was, straight, composed, genuinely present. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, and her expression said without any ambiguity, "I am glad to be here." He believed her. Then Maeve came through the door. She was wearing a dress she'd made herself, which he'd known in advance and which she'd said with characteristic practicality was more sensible than purchasing something she'd have nowhere to wear after. It was blue, a deep, plain blue, the color of the sky over the north pasture in early morning. Her hair was up, which he'd rarely seen, and the effect was not transformation but revelation, the way a thing looks when you see it in different light and understand it more completely. She was not a small woman, and she walked like she knew it, straight and unhurried, and when she reached him, she looked at him the way she looked at everything serious, fully, without flinching. "You're nervous," she said quietly, before the service began. "A little," he said. "Don't be," she said. You know me. I know you. That's the whole thing." He nodded. She was right. She was usually right. The service was short because neither of them had wanted it long. They said what needed to be said. He meant every word. He could tell by the way she said hers, direct, clear, the way she said everything, that she meant them too. Not in the way people mean things in a ceremony, in the elevated temporary sense, in the actual sense. The way a thing is meant when it's been thought through and chosen with full knowledge of the cost. Afterward, there was food at Hallett's, too much of it, the way community gatherings always produce too much. And the kind of noise that happens when people who have worked alongside each other through something difficult find themselves on the other side of it. Mrs. Crane made a toast that was 3 sentences long, and all 3 were true. Hallett's youngest child fell asleep under the table during the second hour, and no one moved him. Vivian found Maeve near the end of the evening, when the crowd had thinned and the fire had burned down in the stove, and people were beginning the slow process of collecting their coats and their children and making their way home. Colt was close enough to hear. He didn't move away. "Are you happy?" Vivian asked. She asked it the same way she'd asked him months ago, in the doorway of the schoolhouse. Direct, without decoration. Maeve considered it the way she considered everything, actually. "Yes," she said. "Not in the easy way. In the real way." She looked at Vivian. "Are you?" Vivian was quiet for a moment. The fire, the last voices of the evening. "I think I'm becoming something," she said, "which might be better than happy." A pause. "I had 17 students this week. One of them, a girl, 8 years old, she came in from the Peterson place. She read a full page aloud on her own for the first time on Friday. She stopped, smiled, small and private. I cried after they all went home, just for a moment." She straightened. "That's not something that was available to me in Cincinnati." Maeve looked at her. "No," she said, "it wasn't." "So?" Vivian smoothed her coat. "Yes, I think so. Becoming something." They stood together in the diminishing warmth of Hallett's back room, 2 women who had arrived in the same territory through different doors and found, each in her own way, what she'd been moving toward. They did not hug. That was not what either of them was built for. But there was something in the moment that required no name, a mutual recognition, clean and honest, between people who had looked at hard circumstances and declined to be diminished by them. Colt drove them home in the wagon under a September sky that was doing something remarkable, clear and cold and crowded with stars in the way the Montana sky became once the summer haze lifted, so many stars that the darkness between them seemed almost incidental. Maeve sat beside him on the bench with her shoulder against his, and neither of them spoke for most of the 4 miles, which was not silence from exhaustion or from having nothing to say but silence from fullness. The particular quiet of people who have arrived somewhere and are simply being in it. "Duffy's for sale," she said, around the 2nd mile. He looked at her. "I heard." He listed the north section first, the creek-adjacent land. "He won't get what he wanted for it." "No," she said. "He won't." She looked at the stars. "Someone will buy it eventually. Might be worth knowing who." "It might," he said. "We could go to the records office in January," she said, "when things are slower." "We could," he said. She settled against his shoulder again. He kept his eyes on the road. The ranch came into view as they rounded the last bend. The lamp he'd left burning in the window, making a square of yellow light against the dark. The woodpile squared and stacked for the season. The fence line holding, the barn solid against the hillside. It looked in the dark, like what it was. A working place, a real place, the kind of place that had been built honestly and was being built still. He helped her down from the wagon. She went ahead to the door and pushed it open, and the warmth came out to meet them both. Inside, the cabin was the same and not the same. There were her things alongside his now, not merged, not surrendered, but present. Her coat on the hook beside his. Her accounting books stacked on the shelf he'd built for the purpose. The breadboard she'd first used on that second morning, which she'd brought from Alderman's when she moved her things over, hanging now where it had always hung when she was here, on the nail by the door. He closed the door against the September night. She was already at the stove, checking the banked fire. She moved through the space with the ease of someone in a place that knows them. No hesitation, no adjustment, just the natural fluency of belonging somewhere. He stood in the middle of the floor and looked at her and thought about the thing he'd understood slowly over this year, the thing that he couldn't have articulated on that first morning and could now say plainly, if only to himself, that belonging is not given, it's made. By people who decide that something is worth working on and then show up for it day after day, imperfectly and honestly and without guarantee of outcome. Maeve had understood this from the beginning. It was perhaps the first thing she'd understood and the thing that had made everything else possible. She'd walked through his door and looked at a place that was neglected and underestimated, and she'd treated it like it was worth the work. She'd done the same with him, which was either a gift or a decision, or most likely, both. I thought about what the year had cost each of them and what it had produced. He thought about Vivian becoming something in a schoolhouse in Silver Creek, reading aloud to herself in the empty room after 17 children had gone home. He thought about Mrs. Crane at the table with the water access numbers, and the Petersons who had held, and the Hallett family who had given what they had. He thought about the investigator Marsh with her leather satchel, and the letter from Helena, and Duffy at the gate with his arguments used up. He thought about all the ways that things had not gone smoothly, had not resolved cleanly, had required more from everyone than anyone had initially thought they had to give. That was the actual story of it. Not the romance, not the difficulty, but the specific texture of a real year with real consequences and real people who were flawed in real ways and kept going anyway. He thought there was something worth saying about that. Not a lesson, exactly. Not the kind of thing that arrived neatly packaged with a bow. More like an observation from someone who had lived a particular year and come out the other side of it knowing something he hadn't known going in. What he'd learned was this: the things that last are not the things that come easily. They are not the things you are given, or the things you fall into, or the things that happen to you while you're waiting for something better. They are the things you choose, specifically, clearly, with full knowledge of the cost. And then choose again every morning when the work is hard and the weather is bad and the outcome is uncertain. He had chosen this. He had not chosen it wisely from the start. He had made errors and moved slowly and hurt someone who deserved better along the way. But he had chosen it finally and fully. And he had been chosen in return by a woman who did not choose things casually, and that meant something that no amount of smooth romantic narrative could improve upon. The fire in the stove caught well. Maeve straightened up and turned and found him standing in the middle of the floor looking at her. "You're doing that thing," she said. "What thing?" "Standing there thinking," she said. "You've been doing it since October." "I've been thinking about the same thing since October," he said. She crossed the room and stood in front of him and looked up at him with the look that was not soft and not assessing and not any of the other specific looks he'd cataloged over the year. It was something simpler, just her, looking at him, without anything in the way. "And," she said, "and I think it's turned out well," he said. She put her hand against his chest, flat, direct, the way she did everything. She could feel his heartbeat. He knew this because she'd told him once, bluntly, that his heartbeat was slower than most people's, and she found it reassuring, which was perhaps the least sentimental declaration of affection he'd ever received, and also, for that reason, one of the most true. "It's turned out honestly," she said. "Which is better." He put his hand over hers. Outside, the September stars were doing their enormous, indifferent work above the Montana Territory, above the basin and the creek and the North Pasture Fence, and the town of Silver Creek, where a small school was dark for the night. Above the graves and the trails and the roads that had brought people from everywhere to this particular place at this particular time. The territory did not notice what had happened here this year. It would not commemorate it. It would simply go on, as it always did, offering the same difficult ground to whoever showed up willing to work it. Colt Mercer and Maeve Rowan, now Mercer, stood in the lamplight of a cabin that had been neglected and repaired and transformed by small, honest acts over the course of 1 year, and they were not perfect people, and they were not finished people, and the life ahead of them would be difficult in the specific and unpredictable ways that frontier life was always difficult. But they were here. They had chosen to be here, and in the morning the work would continue, and they would do it together, and that, when you stripped away everything decorative and sentimental and untrue, was exactly enough. It was in fact everything.